This episode is brought to you by Instant Impact. Instant Impact provides transformative talent solutions to small and mid-sized companies that are making between 30 and 500 hires each year. If your recruitment's giving you a headache and you don't know where to start, then give the team at Instant Impact a call or visit www.instant-impact.com for more information. Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell, and I, like many of you, am a massive fan of the Olympics. The weird and wonderful sports, the stories of people pushing them right to the limits of what's humanly possible. So it's a real treat to be able to peek behind the curtain and learn more about all of the work, all of the years, all of the tears that lead up to that one race, and to see what lessons in leadership and performance we can take and apply to our own lives and our own businesses. Our guest today is Mehdi Kordi, and he is the most successful track cycling coach in history. Mehdi's led, coached and supported track cyclists to 9 Olympic medals, over 15 world championship titles and 6 world records. That is nuts. Mehdi's currently the head of performance support and innovation at Ineos Grenadiers. He's a public speaker, a mentor, and as you'll find out, a generally great guy. Mehdi, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Felix. Happy to be here.
So, jumping in then, why do teams need coaches?
Good question, Felix. A coach has a lot of different definitions. I went to a coaching conference where they couldn't even define what a coach was. But in my paradigm or point of view, a coach is there to get the best out of you or kind of realize as much potential of you as possible. So why does an athlete need coaches? To have someone to be able to understand them and get the best out of them.
And is that, I mean, I can talk to, I guess, myself both as a, well, mostly as a professional, where I'm often not the best, sort of the best judge of my own strengths, where I find that external perspective really interesting. But then also as a pretty average athlete back in my school days, where that person that's sort of been there, done that, and seen successful strategies elsewhere, and essentially someone to tell you what to do to be successful, that is helpful. And I think otherwise, do you feel like, you said that some people can coach themselves. Is that purely on the motivation side of things, or are you talking about also being able to know what's going to get them to peak performance as well?
I've never actually discussed in detail about the people who have. There's only 2 people I've ever met who said they've coached themselves. I've never really sort of interrogated to see what that looked like. But to piggyback on the point you made about when you were younger to where you are now, when you're younger, a coach is generally technical. So if you go to under 11s, I'm making this up here, football team or rowing or whatever, it's mainly about a coach's organisation and technical, so how to execute skills and play. The older you get, I think the technical aspect is very important, but then it's more the understanding of the person, so the emotional and mental side of things, where we seem to overlook a lot of. So when we think of a coach, particularly in sport, everyone thinks technical, or tactical, which does play. But to kind of give you an insight, in my in the Paris Olympics just gone, we had 7 days of racing. I must have done about an hour's worth of technical coaching.
Wow. That's really interesting. And I feel like cycling's a particularly interesting one. It's similar to, so I was the sport I did when I was growing up was rowing, which I think probably shares a few characteristics with cycling, in that it's sort of simultaneously both a team sport and a very individual sport. So do coaches bring different things to the team than they do to the individual?
So track cycling is just to give you a bit more of a nuanced view. You're right. I call track cycling or cycling a squad sport. meaning you're not necessarily a team per se. So technically speaking, if you have one individual, whether it's right on the track, they can have a lot of success by themselves. And I'm just, when people say it's the team or that's just them trying to dress up what it actually is a squad. So we all need to kind of work each other and manage each other. But ultimately, it's an individual. So, and having more in a squad does help. But it's, like I said, it's a very individual sport. There are in events, for example, the team time trial on the road, the team pursuit and the team sprint on the track, which require everyone to kind of contribute to something. But unlike a team, in cycling, it's quite easy to quantify who the weakest person is or who the weakest chain is. So, that can always end up in more of a finger pointing exercise than anything else.
That's very interesting. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the job of a coach when you're looking at a squad to have that culture of winning?
Good question. You can no longer say it's for the team. You can to a certain extent, because the team events are the blue ribbon events, but ultimately everyone is all in it for themselves. So if you say, do you want a gold medal in the team sprint or an individual sprint, they'll always say the individual sprint. To manage that, it's more of a individual approach than sort of a group one. Now, obviously, there are things that matter for the group. So, for example, announcements or equipment changes and stuff like that. But while it is a squad, it's between you and the rider individually, and then you have to be a bit more transparent, communicating how that works with the other riders. So let me give you an example. So if there's a new handlebar that can give an aerodynamic advantage, you have to roll that out with the squad. So because one is getting someone, if you give it to one person, they get a significant advantage to everyone else. So they think, well, is that person worth more than me, irrespective of how successful they are? Whereas if you want to nuance or individualize a training plan, that's more between you and the rider, because if you do it with everyone gets the same treatment, but the outcomes or the exercises they do or the training they do is specific to them. So it's a bit of a hybrid or a mishmash of knowing when to address it as a team or as a squad and when to do it as an individual.
And I see parallels to the world of work there. If everyone has the same opportunity, but everyone has different strengths and weaknesses, and you have to take a tailored approach.
Exactly. I think so. Everyone always, when you go into coaching or management, whatever you want to call it, everyone always likes to say that I treat everyone the same, or they treat everyone the same. And, that to me is a false fallacy, in a sense that you can't treat everyone the same. Let's just take a position, whatever position it might be, junior or senior. You have a 20-year-old male, single, no kids, no relationship, and a 50-year-old female with 3 kids who's a solo parent. You have to judge them the same, but you can't treat them the same. And I think that's what everyone always seems to start out in management or coaching, to try to be idealistic. But the reality is you have to treat everyone individually and judge them equally.
Absolutely. Right. Let's move on to your massive, storied, successful career. Because I'd love to unlock some of the things that made you so successful. So many gold medals. What do you think were the secrets behind that success? And actually, maybe if you could just take us back, if you could just explain to people who aren't familiar with the world of Dutch competitive cycling, what journey you took the team on from joining to when you left.
Yeah, I think ultimately, this is an interesting one in its own right. I've never ridden a bike competitively at any level or any discipline. So I can ride a bike, obviously, but I've never actually competed. So, I've never come from that angle of, I was a world-class rider or a good rider and therefore have credibility. In fact, it was the other way around. It was interesting, actually, because before the Dutch, I was still successful, but in a more kind of less obvious way. And I basically had sort of three successful parts of my success. So the first one is after I left British Cycling, went to an amateur team in Derby. They called themselves the People's Republic of Barbados. We had 5 people. That was a gene pool we had to choose from. And they were actually my stakeholder, the team stakeholder. So they were my boss. I had to drop one person for every ride we did, which was quite awkward. In any case, for that, what was successful there, we had to think outside the box. Rather than trying to outwork or be technically better or train smarter than anyone else, we had our identity, or the way we won, was out engineering people. So we couldn't improve our power very much to compete with the big boys. So we ended up, there's a more detailed story to this, but in the end, we ended up out engineering people. So trying to reduce that aerodynamic drag than actually doing any training. So all our focus was on that. So that first part of the story was basically out engineering. When I got to the Dutch, it was more about sort of streamlining and understanding like where the biggest gains are and focusing that. So when I got there, the whole marginal gains ideology was big in every sport, particularly in the Dutch, and we were quite low on resources in finances and material, but they were still trying to do the whole marginal gains, like do little things that we can't even measure, move the needle, improve them all a lot, and then put them all together to make them a significant gain. Whereas I had to bin that off. I thought that was a poor waste of resource, and I can't think of a fancy name, but I just called it major gains. So in other words, we just listed all the things that were important for performance and just focused on the top 2, and the next 2 or 3, if the opportunities, resource and time arose, we'd look into it. But ultimately, going into the Tokyo Olympics, all I cared about was the skin suits and the overshoes, because they were the thing that would have improved our performance more than anything else. So overshoes, so the socks they put over the shoes. So again, to give the listeners a bit more understanding, the textiles the rider wears has the biggest significant impact on their performance. So basically, it reduces their aerodynamic drag. So rather than focusing on the chains, the chain rings, the sprockets, the wheels, the tires, all I cared about were those 2 things, and everything else I made it very clear I wasn't interested in. And the common theme between the first and the second part of my career I just talked about, from a cultural point of view, which is obviously probably a bit more relevant from an HR perspective, was that I did not recognize culture. I just said performance is the utmost thing, and a win-all-cost mentality is all I care about. So you could come late as long as you performed. You could sleep poorly as long as you performed. You could go on the lash every night as long as you performed. But that was kind of a self-policing, where we didn't have time to talk about who we are, our identity, or anything like that, which is rather controversial. But if the shoe fits, you had to wear it. And I think someone explained to me about, and again, I'm not a psychologist or an expert in team mechanics. You have the 4 phases of becoming a high-performing team, which is forming, storming, norming, and performing. I think he said we were definitely storming because we're dysfunctional as a team, but ultimately I skipped out the norming stage, which is structures, process, consequences, understanding, clarity, and just went straight to performing. I was like, just make this shoe fit and wear it. The reason why I say this, because this led into the third part of the story, which is going to Paris, which was less about innovation, less about sort of streamlining, understanding what's important, and more about the culture aspect. And I think that I don't want to go into too much detail, but ultimately the win-at-all-cost mentality kind of consumed the team and myself and became unsustainable, because people were doing all sorts of things, but they were winning, and that cost or gave a split in the team, meaning that you had the high performers who could do what they want, and the people on a different trajectory who were buying into the processes and everything else, and the support staff and the expertise, but just not as fast, who weren't getting the same treatment. So ultimately I had to, going back to that model of forming, storming, norming, performing, introduce the norming stage, which was, and then sort of the clarity and understanding. And then, so that was that part. But also as well, from my point of view, was understanding how to survive in a high-performing environment where stakes are high, pressure is high. And ultimately there's an expression saying, control the controllables, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard, which was a really good bit of advice, because you get to control yourself. You introduce some boundaries, some borders, look after yourself a bit more, because I wasn't in good health. But then ultimately that's not a good way of leading, because you get quite passive and dismissive of opportunities. So I realized that I have to control the controllables to survive. And that's kind of the main aspect of things, that you have to survive and be healthy first, but influence the uncontrollables to thrive. In other words, as a leader, you can't just be passive. You have to, there are so many people you have to deal with, not just yourself, that you have to influence their way of thinking, even though you can't control them. So that's a real kind of synopsis of there are different stages. I didn't actually copy and paste anything in every different stage.
It's interesting, I think, that you obviously came into the team and realized that you had to make a lot of progress very quickly. So presumably that's where you came up with your list of the elements that would most impact, or the innovations that would most impact performance. Was that an exercise that was led by instinct, by data? How did you get that initial list where you then decided to focus on the skin suits and the overshoes?
Everything I did was out of necessity, so it wasn't like this over strategic thing, and that's why there are kind of three different parts, because it was just to make it work. I had to, engage in that aspect of what I had to do. Regarding the list, it was just more the fact of we had a very modest budget, so I think we're the 13th or 12th most funded nation, and over a sixth of the budget of British cycling, for example. And so they had 36 million euros for the Olympic cycle, and we had 6, and they actually went. The difference was even bigger in the Paris cycle. In any case, it was just out of necessity. So we didn't have much money. We were spreading ourselves thin on different projects, and ultimately, all I cared about was I had to make a choice that what would make the juice worth the squeeze. In other words, what was going to give us a positive and disproportional return of investment. So in other words, like if we were going to invest, X amount of money and time, what would give us way more return that is really worth our while.
Yeah. So that definitely makes sense. I guess I'm just interested in how did you do the ranking? How did you know that skin suits were going to be the most impactful? Yeah. Best bang for buck?
Okay, right, yeah. So the ranking was just from previous experience and what we could actually measure. So, for example, and could we measure it? So let me give you an example. Like a chain, we had a theory that if we went for a certain pitch of a chain, it would have an advantage. Right, okay, how would we measure that? Well, we couldn't really, it's all theoretical, and it would cost more than it's worth. So so we had that kind of made a table, which was like the aspect of it, or whatever it is, the factor. Could we measure it? And if so, what impact will it have from the best and the worst in the market? And that was stuff that we had from experience in the previous teams that I'd had an understanding of what affects what. And you can also model it as well. Like with cycling, everything can be measured, and I mean everything. So you can model it quite simply using an Excel spreadsheet and a few numbers here and there.
Well, it's really cool. And again, sorry, I don't want to labor the point for the audience, but it's interesting there about an exercise that we so rarely go through in the workplace is, where are the levers we can pull? Where can we invest in our business that will make a material impact on performance? And can we measure what impact it would make? And I guess what bang for our buck do we get from each investment? And these days, everything in the workplace is measurable as well, pretty much.
But I think that's quite negative in the sense that one of the things we also did in the Dutch across my period there, so it kind of overlaps at all the period, was going away from being too data driven. And what I mean by that is, which is again going against the gradient of the modern society or modern way of business. Let me tell you why. Data is just, we identify it as being measurable and therefore a number, and people think it doesn't have an opinion or a bias. But what we don't do is look at it's an instrument, and instruments have error, they have validity issues, reliability issues, sensitivity issues, and we just see a number and it feeds our confirmation bias. Let me give you an example. We have devices that can measure our sleep, for example, and we just live and die by it. A lot of people say, "Oh, my sleep's down." This is said that I'm not feeling well, so therefore I'm not feeling well. When the reality is, like, You look well, you're energetic, you're full of the joys of spring. It's hardly sort of painting like the picture you on death's door. So it's immense understanding like what were the signal from the noise. And actually, like I said, you can measure everything in cycling: power, speed, cadence, time, yaw, roll, pitch, and go on forever. The only thing we measured or monitored is probably the best thing. Was one measure throughout the whole Olympic cycles, which was essentially a standing start data, because it was reliable and repeatable. So it was always from a standing start from 0 speed, and then the acceleration to the 15 and 65 meters. And again, I'm going to technicalities here. It demonstrated how good you were going to be. It was overly predictive, so it was a disproportionately positive prediction for the time you spent doing it. And actually ended up publishing a paper on it in the scientific journal about that. But that's the only thing we measured, and the rest I relied on my emotional intelligence, my social dynamic intelligence, and good old-fashioned intellectual intelligence to kind of interpret this all.
Very cool. Very cool. Now, I don't think my audience will forgive me if I didn't pick you up on this culture piece, because we're an HR podcast and there is a generally accepted wisdom. You've got to get, that culture is the fundamentals, the foundation of high performance. But it sounded like, for a time at least, you think it's possible to skip the cultural piece and just move straight to performance. So I wonder what lessons you learned through, that was the 2020 Olympics, wasn't it?
You're going into it, yeah. And then the team before that. In sport, which I'm sure is akin or comparable to business, people are brought in to get results, first and foremost. I've never seen an athlete or a coach or someone say, we are rubbish and we're underperforming from a results perspective, but our culture is great. And if they haven't lasted the distance. So ultimately, you have to go in there and you have to deliver, and you have to deliver in a certain time frame. To put it in a business, I don't know, if you're a startup and you're running out of money and time, do you want a good culture, someone who fits your team, or someone who can get it done and have to manage them? Now, I took the latter approach because I needed results, and that was the quickest way I was going to fast track here, just making it all performance focused and win at all cost mentality. What I think it can't do, that sort of aspect, is be sustainable for the person who's delivering it, first and foremost, and maybe just for the longevity of it. So this is why I think in sport you have peaks and troughs or cycles, where they hit a performance, and then I really believe that culture is revealed when you're successful, because then you really see when people start pushing their weight around. There's an expectation that people want to value themselves more, and the culture is really revealed. And I think cultural and behavioural things they really become more important once you've established success, once you've got expectations. But without that, you can't establish it. So I'd say for more sustained high performance, from the medium to short to long term, is where it's really more important.
Yeah, I definitely see your point around culture revealing itself during times of success, and it's sort of in a weird way, when times are hard, it's actually, it can be easier to create the right culture, right? Your culture is, we're underdogs, we're under the grind. You're either with us or you're not. Come on, everyone, let's go. It's almost like a wartime culture.
So I mean, this kind of, again, I'm not a psychologist, I've just made these theories up myself, but when you're a startup, and like you said, there's underdog culture, like us against the world, the siege mentality, then you start performing above expectation, and that's kind of the sweet spot when you're like, yeah, like we are really, really like performing way more than we should do, and then the expectation sets in, and that's when it all changes, because all of a sudden the people who've been driving that change, things change. So they say, I want to be valued more, so I want to be paid more, or I want to do this more, or this less, or this is not how it used to be. And then you really kind of see how the cultural comes about, because all of a sudden there's an expectation, and then people start pointing fingers. So it's this kind of a natural trend, and then people kind of quit or stay. So then what happens after that is the real key. So anyone can achieve success. It's more sustaining it. That's the big one.
That resonates. I guess feeding into the sustainable versus, I guess, quick big bang success.
Short-term success, yeah.
Yeah. is that sort of where the marginal versus major gains fits in? Is it possible to sustainably make major gains for the long term, or does that also go in cycles?
I think it does. It's just about not necessarily reinventing it, but you can always shift the way you look at it. So your major gains can be not going from 2 to 3, or 2 to 5, or from 5 to 1 to focus it all. I just believe in business and in sport. I say not business. That's none of my business in going into business, but in sport, the thing that really kind of trips teams up, in my experience, is stagnation. And we always did it this way, and therefore we're always going to do it. And like I said, when you get successful, a bit of an ego kicks in. I don't mean that in a negative way, but so who are you telling me what to do? Like, I built this. We've always done it this way. Therefore, I'm going to do it. So it's more kind of the limiting factor, not necessarily the major gains or the marginal gains. I just think that's kind of a efficiency system, or kind of a philosophy or a mindset of how you want to get about it. And there are pros and cons for both of them. I just stick with this one because I think that gives more pros than cons. I think it's more the trying to reinvent and sort of keep the mindset fresh than stagnate into this is what we've always done. That's the biggest challenge to success.
So I think we've spoken a lot about the pieces that go into a high performing team. I wonder whether you can put your finger on anything that you think made your squad the gold medalists, the overall winners of the cycling in the 24 Olympics. I think beating out Team GB. Thanks, man. But I guess, is there anything you're like, it was that made the difference between silver and gold?
For the Paris cycle, you mean the one just gone?
No, I don't know. Whichever, either Olympic.
Okay, well, I think they all had different stories, and I think there were different lessons from them. And I didn't do a lift and shift in terms. I didn't just copy paste of what I did. I think ultimately, and this is something I've been sort of soul searching a bit myself, and I still can't. Maybe there is a psychological paradigm that I haven't sort of understood, or maybe there's a new one that we haven't unearthed yet. But
maybe we'll figure it out right now.
Yeah, well, maybe we will. Maybe. But I think it's the relationship between the coach and the rider, and what I mean by that is, like, I ended up setting a 30-minute meeting every week with every rider and staff member, and that was a total of 8 hours, which sounds like a lot, and people will be gasping, going, "I don't have 8 hours a week." But that was, as a coach, head coach, that was the best investment of time I ever made, because you get to read the room without actually needing to be in it. You get to understand the temperature of the team, where it's going, where things are cropping up, and people feel felt and heard, and you can understand where they're coming from and get a sort of overarching decision of how to go about things. So it was more about the relationship and understanding the athletes and addressing their, reinforcing what they're good at and addressing their weaknesses. So, for example, we had one rider going to Tokyo Games, and she actually had a heart attack. And this is all kind of well documented, like in the media. I'm not sharing confidential information here. 5 years before the games, and I think in the end, the men's team were the most dominant team going into the Tokyo Games, and the women weren't getting much attention. And it was just working with her, understanding what works for her, rather than just copy pasting what the men do. Which catapulted her to winning the keirin gold in Tokyo. And then in the Paris cycle, we had another athlete. She had eating disorders and all sorts. Again, that's been documented, so it's not anything bad. Sorry, it is bad, but it was it's sharing any.
Yeah, you're not breaking confidentiality here. It's not a we need to talk about HR scoop.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, but ultimately, again, understanding her and just working with her how best to get the most out of her, and spending that time with her, understanding it really sort of helped us catapult. And there were just 2 case studies, but that was just genuinely with the squad. So going back to it all, it was less transactional and more towards transformational. But again, with a coach, athlete, and I guess the same in the business. It's very dynamic, and people see things for like what managers and coaches are or leaders are in different ways. But for me, it was more kind of establishing that relationship and going towards a transformational aspect of it, where you really understand and trust each other, rather than just being kind of the all-knowing person to tell them what to do.
Yeah. And I think there's two instances, there's two, I guess, illnesses in different ways of your athletes. I mean, maybe the separation between mental and physical health and work or performance in sport is closer, but maybe it isn't. How did you get over how did you get the best out of those athletes from a starting point of, I guess they probably wouldn't have seen it this way, but disadvantage, one who's had a serious, I guess like near-death experience with a heart attack, and the other with an eating disorder. I mean, most people, you just say, look, I just don't think professional sport's healthy or good for you. How did you toe that line between pastoral care and what's sensible and healthy for them and performance?
Without trying to sound sort of or jumping on the bandwagon of treat the human first or anything like that. That is essentially what I did. And the reason why I got to that conclusion was one of the first races I had. My son was newly born, was ill, and I was away at a race in Glasgow, and I'm based in Manchester. And my wife we had no parents to kind of help out, so my wife was by herself, and my head had completely gone. So I was there in person, and not very present. It was just constantly like, is everything all right at work? Sorry, at home. And I remember speaking to someone, and they were like, "Oh, look, she has to be strong. She'll look after the baby. You have to stay here and all this stuff." I just thought, right, okay, maybe I'm being soft. And I remember that there was there's a kind of a guy who was a performance coach for the Olympic Committee, not necessarily the cycling team. He was there, and he found out what was up, and he just went, just go home straight away, and look after your family. And then on reflection, when I spoke to him, I was like, why did you let me do that? Because it was very, very helpful. Like, honestly, that was really needed. And he was saying, if you're not happy at home, if you're not comfortable in yourself, you're never going to be comfortable and be able to perform at work. And that always resonated with me, because that really did help. And knowing that someone, number one, understood you as a human, or had, just understood you as a human being, like what takes priorities. And ultimately that kind of mindset and outset kind of gives you that trust of actually that this person is someone you can trust and rely on to understand you. And I think that's the same approach I took with the athletes. In the first instance, I just never made it a thing. It was more kind of to get the buy-in of people. You have to show some sort of technical proficiencies, and not just going to like buy into you because you speak to them once a week for 30 minutes. But ultimately, other than that, I never made it a thing. It was more just trying to see what makes them tick, what they get enjoyment out of, and what's affecting them. Because we're all human at the end of the day. We've all got things that are going on in our private life which are always kind of quite debilitating, and people always seem to forget that. Progressing in your career, usually you also get more problems in your personal life because you get more responsibilities, and it's more just about not necessarily sharing every sort of minute detail with me, but having that level of trust where they can say, like, I'm not feeling very well today because of this, and thinking of a way of going about it rather than just saying, like, you're here to train and then you can go home.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Well, Mehdi, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Felix. Hope you enjoyed it.